are perfect beyond measure.
Amen. Praise the Lord, everybody. And thank you, Dr. Davis, for bringing up the one of my favorite characters in Christian history, and Saint Patrick, and that fabulous prayer, and for that wonderful song that the Lord gave you to share with us on today. What a real blessing. Everybody, I'm Kwesi Kamau, and as my brother Bob has shared, I do pastor here in Dallas, Texas, the Impact Church DFW. It's a real dope church with a whole lot of dope folk who love God and love to serve God and serve God's people and serve the community. I also lead in the Impact Discipleship movement, and we focus in uh, on the issue of unity and justice and discipleship. We're talking about bringing unity to the church and justice to the world. Um, you know, Dr. Davis said something else that I thought was really important when he got started. And his words were, Jesus is the key. Jesus is the key. He's the key to everything. And so, as we look at all the things that are going on in our world, all the problems and all the answers that we need, we find that all in Jesus. And as an extension of that, Jesus being the key means that the church is the key. The church is the key in the world. And so it's very important for us to grow up into what it is that God has purposed for us. And if the church is the key, if Jesus is the key and the church is the key, then also unity is key. We got to be together, y'all. And unity is not something that happens by declaration. Unity is something that we grow up into, which is why discipleship is so important. It's what discipleship has to do with all of this matter. So, listen, I am a preacher. We have just worshipped and we have just prayed, and I'm ready to go. But in order to fit the time that has been given to me, just my good friend Hank, asked me to talk about John Wesley, which is kind of my area. It's what I have my doctoral work in. And so, I could go on and on and on. And so what I've done for the sake of time and efficiency is I have pre-recorded my lecture so that we can have some time both to listen and then hopefully take a few moments afterwards to engage and to talk. So as the video is playing, I'm going to ask for you to consider these things. As the video was playing, what was concerning to you? What made you curious? You want to know something more about? And then what convicted you, either in the way that you need to change or in the way that you need to move? So, what are you curious about? What are you concerned about? What are you convicted about? I'll throw these up on the screen in a minute. But right now, without any further ado, let me go ahead and get this technical stuff together and share this video with us all.
Hello, I'm Dr. Kwesi Kamau. Years ago, I attended Wheaton College for undergraduate studies. I wasn't there long before I became known for getting into what they call good trouble. At about this time, it was the first time that I heard the name Don Davis. The year that I came was the year after Don Davis had left Wheaton. And I was told all over campus that I was the next Don Davis. Well, Don Davis is too unique a brother to be lumped in with anybody. And for my part, I've only been good at being me. But here I am again, coming after Don Davis and picking up where he left off. I'm honored to be here and grateful to be able to be a front row witness of what God is doing here. Sacred Roots is a necessary idea to culture, a deep and wide generationally impactful move of God. Candidly, if you don't care about this kind of broad impact, then this subject might not matter to you. But if you have a hunger to transform a generation, this is necessary. You often hear that disciple making is life on life. This axiom is true, but there are so many more levels. Disciple making happens one on one, but as we see with Jesus, it can happen on 1-on-3, or 1-on-12, 1-on-72, or even 1 to more than 100. Bobby Harrington and my good friend Alex Absalom make this point very clear in their book, Discipleship That Fits. Discipleship is not flat. It is a three-dimensional thing. But now, with Sacred Roots, we might even imagine a fourth dimension. Sacred Roots is a life-on-life process that works in a different way, because what you're doing is you're reading the words and reading the lives of extraordinary believers throughout history. And that situates you, listen, that situates you not just as an individual, but as a traveler with others through the vast Serengeti of God's big plan. Now, here are two ways that it works. Number one, the people that we read in Sacred Roots inspire us. They are testaments of how God moves in contemporary times. Now, when I came to faith, I wanted to know if the God that moved in the Bible still move powerfully in the world today. It is vital to learn doctrinal facts, but to see people applying theology in real time is inspiring. The second thing that Sacred Roots does is it's implied in its name. Sacred Roots connects us to the many branches of God's great story, blossoming from here to there in this time or that time. The thing I think the church needs most right now is to grow up into the unity of the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature. With more than 10,000 Christian denominations around the world from 300 major traditions, unity will not come through institutional adherences. It will come when we see sacred wisdom within traditions other than our own that connect back to our common roots, our historical sacred roots. And let me say this, let me say something parenthetically. We can see God's wisdom in times, places, and people that we commonly skip over. We find wisdom in the spiritual exercises of Ignatius de Loyola, like the Moravians did, for instance, who then taught John Wesley, who then, as we will see in a moment, made it the engine of his movement. We can find wisdom in the layered recipients of Teresa of Avila and her great vision, a castle made of a single diamond that contains 7 mansions representing our journey to a spiritual maturity. We can find wisdom in the elegance and simplicity of Francis of Assisi. Oh man, I love Francis, who realized the preciousness of everyone and everything that God made. The way of Francis was so impactful, he walked into the camp of the Muslim leader Suleiman, Sultan al-Qasim, in the middle of the Crusades, preached the unadulterated gospel of God and was received well and was sent home by the Sultan with honor and respect. From more modern times, we can learn the disciplines of the Spirit with Howard Thurman. We can learn social justice with James Cone and Bell Hooks. We can pull from a well of deep spiritual depth with Gustavo Gutierrez. All these witnesses enrich me and help me look past the limits of my worldview. They help me to see what Paul called in Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 10, the multicolored, ultra-diverse mystery of God. Through the collection curated by the Sacred Roots Project, we will be enriched and inspired to become more mature. We will see the Spirit of God moving from culture to culture and generation to generation and learn to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Now, I've been asked to talk about John Wesley and his tactic of developing a Sacred Roots-like Christian library for his own movement leaders and disciples. Now, this was a shrewd tactic. In 1750, Wesley produced the Christian Library Extracts from the abridgments of the choicest pieces of practical divinity, which have been published in the English tongue. Some folk thought it was a waste of time and money to develop these volumes, but Wesley saw something they did not see. Wesley's contemporaries, George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, left reputation and they left writings, but Wesley left a movement. And Wesley's movement was resilient. It was resilient enough to outlive him and spawn major gospel movements long after he died. Wesley considered the enterprise of editing, publishing, and distributing his personally selected 50-volume collection of Christian writings vital to this resilience. How did it work? Will it work today? These questions are the questions that we will explore together. In our talk today, we will survey John Wesley's movement, method, and management. His movement, method, and management. We will examine the mechanics of John Wesley's movement to show how his sacred roots-like stratagem worked in his system. We will review why Wesley was passionate about the Christian library and what impact it actually had. And finally, we will look at some practical lessons from its use. A survey of Wesley's movement, methods, and management would be pointless if we are lost on what Wesley was after. Wesley sought to disrupt, discredit, and replace shallow Christianity. Christian shallowness had many natural causes, as you can imagine, things like laziness and selfishness and lack of discipline. But there were also significant social issues at play. On one hand, England was tired. They were tired of the troubles caused by years of religious factionalism. They went through a whole century of war, revolution, and social upheaval based on whether you were Catholic or Protestant, Calvinist or Arminian, Church of England or dissenting church. Therefore, many church leaders leaned into general politics and philosophy rather than spiritual practices and the care for souls and bodies. Beautiful liturgy became an end in itself rather than the doorway to experiencing God. They promoted spiritual neutrality, tolerance, and reason over emotion. Now, they had a big word for this, and they called it latitudinarianism. So basically, they told everybody, just be cool and don't rock the boat. Now, on the other hand, many parish pastors and lay people who found the church's spirituality lacking looked to the revivals that were spreading across Britain and America during the Great Awakening, right? We talk about the wonders of the Great Awakening, but many of these local revivals had no shortage of fanaticism and spiritual abuse. They had cult-like groups popping up from place to place. They were heavy on experience, but they were light, shallow on character. So on one side, you have latitudinarianism, and on the other side, spiritual looseness. Wesley pinpointed the causes of all these problems as a lack of real, deeply rooted Christian formation. The reason Britain tore itself apart during the Troubles, the reason the church emphasized tolerance and neutrality, the reason cults so easily caught people in their net was because there was not enough perfecting of faith, love, and hope. As a master organizer, then, John Wesley led a movement that made an extraordinary impact. He used methods and management that fostered spiritual depth, both individually and across communities. As we will see, the Christian library fits centrally into this work. We are talking about John Wesley because of the extraordinary impact his movement had. Because he did not produce a work of systematic theology per se, he was by and large ignored in the broader discussions of Christian history for about 150 years after he died. Yet some scholarship is beginning to rank him among Calvin and Luther in overall impact. We now move to mark Wesleyanism's sheer breadth of impact in Britain and America. Its impact on social and cultural issues like Euro-American slavery, democracy, and social responsibility, and how this movement impacted generations after him. But first, let me talk about Wesley's impact on me. In my college years, I wrestled with the question of whether I could be Black and Christian at the same time. It was a time of resurgence of the Black consciousness movement. And I lived in Chicago, around the corner of Mayor Harold Washington, Chicago's first Black mayor, and down the street from Louis Farrakhan, leader of the Nation of Islam, who was then making his national splash. I talked with Black Muslims on street corners and Black nationalists in bookstores. So I keenly knew the objections to Christianity on racial grounds and the poisonous history of racism in the church. I was not surprised by apostasy like this apostasy in the church, but I did need to see the move of the Spirit. Jonathan Edwards did nothing against slavery, but gave it a passing nod. George Whitefield lobbied for slavery in Georgia in a moment when the state could have gone another way. I knew the Christian freedom work of Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey and Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass against slavery, but did the Spirit convict of sin, righteousness, and judgment among white people? And I saw a significant beginning with John Wesley. Wesley's movement was no small movement. In 1791, the year that John Wesley died, the purged roll of confirmed Christ disciples in the Methodist movement in the United States alone was 63,269. Another 58,000 formed societies throughout Britain. A swell of people surrounded this core number, boosting the number of Methodist followers to hundreds of thousands. When you review the death roll of Methodists over the 50 years that John Wesley was in ministry, then the number approaches nearly 200,000 disciples that have been made under Wesley's ministry. Wesley's movement had pervasive influence both in Britain and in North America. The former young missionary to Georgia, who could not even hold a post here, had an enormous impact later on in life. It is said that Wesley was a significant influence in the demise of slavery in Britain, and his followers advocated against the peculiar institution of slavery in the United States. In 1774, Wesley published a tract, Thoughts on Slavery, which changed the public mood on the subject in his day. He often publicly spoke against the vile institution of slavery and exerted his influence with public political leaders and influential members of society. American Methodist leaders, Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury, closely followed Wesley's lead. Coke unsuccessfully advocated against slavery at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Coke and Asbury both spoke vociferously against slavery and commanded Methodist itinerant preachers to do the same very early on. But they tempered their speech a little later, however, when Southern enslavers threatened not to allow Methodists to preach to the enslaved African populations that they held in captivity. In the subsequent generations, Methodism in the United States would triple in numbers, but correspondingly, it would diminish in anti-slavery fervor. In fact, the church would split north and south over the issue of slavery by 1844. Wesley's greatest fear had begun to come true. Wesley had prophetically warned, close to the end of his life, I am not afraid that the people called Methodist should ever cease to exist either in Europe or America. But I am afraid lest they should only exist as a dead sect, having the form of religion without the power. And this undoubtedly will be the case unless they hold fast to both the doctrine, spirit, and discipline with which they first set out. Wesley's work impacted slavery and other issues as well. With the reflection on their political influence over the first half of the 1800s, U.S. President Ulysses Grant rightly noted three great parties in American politics: Republicans, Democrats, and Methodists. Methodism's social impact reached back to the 1760s in America, energizing the growing democratic spirit of the colonies. Wesley's impact engendered several social changes toward people in poverty, for prisoners in England, and for women. The Methodist movement started very progressively with women, but just like they did with slavery, they retreated from their forward position by the turn of the century. Despite the perfidious institutional turn back, the spirit with which the Methodists first set out still prevailed in people like Mary Evans Thorne, the first woman appointed class leader in the United States in 1770, or Sarah Millay, the first woman itinerant preacher appointed by John Wesley in 1787, or Phoebe Palmer, the charismatic evangelist and leader of the mid-1800s holiness movement. And then, of course, we have the statuesque queenly Isabel Baumfree, later to take the name Sojourner Truth. I've already made some remarks about the movement's resilience within my conversation about Wesley's impact and influence, and I won't explore the subject anymore for the sake of time, except to make this point. Wesley wanted his movement to extend long after he was gone. Despite some failings, the movement blossomed for 150 years after Wesley died before facing significant systemic decline. Wesley's system worked so well because he left a solid system of training and empowering leaders, and because he desperately and doggedly emphasized making his disciples and leaders connect with sacred roots. John Wesley's methods were powerful, but as we look back on them, they are often highly misunderstood. For instance, David Young-eat Cho, former pastor of the million-member Yoido Full Gospel Church in Korea, built his movement on a cell group model that he attributed to John Wesley. Now, I've seen many small groups do the same, but Wesley's method was about so much more than a group model. Now, let's talk about spiritual formation. Wesley's priority was spiritual formation. The engine for this process was securing qualified experiences with God. Wesley used Bible, tradition, reason, and fellowship to qualify God experiences. Experiences were matched with supernatural encounters in the Bible first, but then also in church history. That's where tradition comes in, or for our purposes, sacred roots. Now, these things could not contradict the essential standards of the apostolic faith. And when we have experiences, they are to reasonably fit within church doctrine. Wesley applied several sacred disciplines for the aspect of fellowship to work. Now, he democratized confession. Once upon a time, confession being centered in a confessional with a trained priest. Now, confession is something that happens within a group. He made it a mutual exercise. He trained his leaders and disciples to do spiritual listening with the Bible and with other spiritual books. They learned group spiritual direction, mutual prayer, and then even spiritual deliverance exercises to cast out evil spirits. Wesley considered the Christian library essential to spiritual formation. It was the power of tradition. Readers could connect their story with the story of God's glory, to apply our new phrase. Now, they could basically match their lives with the lives of the saints of the ages. The Christian library provided depth and breadth to the movement. Ancient and contemporary writings and examples could mentor current believers. Wesley noted his intention in the preface to his work, The Christian Library. I have endeavored to extract such a collection of English divinity as I believe is all true, all agreeable to the oracles of God, and is all practical and all intelligible to plain men. As a tool for virtual mentorship, Wesley could use the library broadly with his burgeoning number of itinerant preachers. Wesley traveled 250,000 miles in his ministry, preaching 15 times a week. He wrote, he edited tracts, he edited books, he wrote commentaries and journals, and he did all of this often on horseback. He did not have time then to personally mentor many people, but he used the library to mentor an entire army. Now, just a few things here to say about accountability and empowerment. Accountability. As I alluded before, Wesley did not do small groups like we do small groups. For this matter, I don't think we should do them as he did. Wesley lived in the golden age of modernism where philosophy was crowned and nations were born and reborn. In the 18th century England, the idea of social morality was spun across the board. Thomas Hobbes set the stage. The individual expresses his or her personal identity best in subjecting and supporting the state. In the 1700s, there was this idea of a democratic nation of subjects. Thus, Wesley could engender a very, if you will, authoritarian system of democratic accountability. Put simply, he could put people in groups who could tell each other what to do. Now, this method will not work today, and whenever you do see it today, it's generally a cult. But what we can learn from Wesley is the principle of accountability, adding spiritual direction to the picture. When we look closely from our 21st century anti-authoritarian postmodern perch at Wesley's groups, they look grisly to many of us. But behind his method was not control. It was catharsis. It was discernment of our experience with God. If it ever became control, then it would die. But mutual confession cleansed the soul before God and crystallized seeing God's hand and hearing God's voice and feeling God's presence. Let me say something about empowerment. Wesley empowered everyone. He raised women to preach and teach. He employed lay people with no theological training. He equipped enslaved and discriminated against Africans to preach an anti-racist gospel. He encouraged children even to do gospel work. Empowerment was a chief motivation for developing the Christian library in light of the fact that these persons that he was raising up had no formal training. Individuals who didn't have this training could develop their minds and have, if you will, seminary on the go. Now let's shift to the conversation about Wesley's powerful management. John Wesley could employ his Christian library effectively due to his powerful management systems. Wesley managed basically two interconnected operations. One operation was about empowering lay disciples. The other conscripted preachers and trained them to develop and lead lay disciple makers. Lay disciple making was accomplished through societies, classes, and bands. Societies, classes, and bands. These were the three groupings or three levels within the Methodist work. A person could enter the Methodist movement through open air church preaching, attending a society meeting, or maybe attending a class. At the beginning of your journey, you would join a class of about 12 people and walk through what it means to be a true Christian. The class would engage in spiritual reading and accountability questions. The reading would walk a believer through Wesley's three stages of spiritual formation: the natural life, the law, and the gospel. The general textbook was a collection of 44 of Wesley's sermons, John Wesley and one including Charles. And these sermons covered how to become a Christian, what it means to be a Christian, and how to deal with the difficulties and temptations as a Christian. It generally took 2 to 3 years before you could actually go through all of the three stages. But once you completed the three stages, you will be assigned to a band of 3 to 5 people. Bands were more intense and had greater accountability and spiritual direction. Methodist societies involved a large grouping of people. When the movement started in 1740s, societies had about 25 to 50 people. But two things happened. John and Charles Wesley's preaching started hitting a note. People started coming more. And the other thing is that Methodists started open air preaching. Societies grew to hundreds of attendees, and eventually they needed to be divided into classes. Once classes began meeting regularly, societies would meet periodically for planning or for leadership training or things like that. But there were some societies that would also meet on Sundays if the local parish in a particular area was unfriendly to Methodists. Discussing societies is a good segue into dealing with the other side of Wesley's operations: training and deploying preachers. The number of trained, ordained ministers who joined John Wesley in his movement started very small and never really kept up with the growing Methodist population. Therefore, they had to travel from community to community, providing preaching and teaching, and providing sacraments when necessary. Each minister was given what was called a district or circuit to travel. It just still, after all of this, was not enough preachers to go around. Now, here's an interesting story. Once Wesley had been absent from his pulpit a long time, and his society became restless. The layman that he left in charge while he was gone felt compelled to take to the pulpit and preach. When Wesley found out, he was incensed. But he was talked into listening to the guy by his mom. He was so impressed that from that point, he started training and teaching lay persons to be lay preachers so that they could minister to the vast Methodist population. He assigned his trained ministers to supervise these lay preachers that spread across England and North America, and the movement continued to grow. Lay preachers were an answer to a big problem, the problem of coverage. But at the same time, they created a new problem, a problem of training. So Wesley organized the preachers into the circuit districts and appointed a meeting that they would go to once a year called an annual conference. During the annual conference, Wesley would train and develop Methodist preachers and examine their character and work. But Wesley knew systems and structures would not be enough. He had good men leading the districts, but they couldn't be charged to mentor all of these new preachers. So 12 years into the movement, Wesley had his answer, the Christian Library. Without a doubt, the Christian Library has had its naysayers. Wesley spent enormous amounts of money and time on the project. He printed 100 copies of the volume and only broke even decades later. Wesley spent all waking hours in preparation for this, pouring through the contents, often with pen in hand while riding his horse through a circuit. The project was really too big for him. He mentioned being rushed to print and only being able to strike out lines and make minor notes. More than 70% of the content was Puritan, that is to say, Calvinist and predestinarian. And Wesley, of course, was an Arminian. He hastily took out all of this kind of stuff, but at the same time, he left in the parts that he thought would be inspiring. Now, Wesley only included a spattering of early church writings, and he did nothing with the medieval periods. Such was his bias against anything before the Reformation. Most of his entries dated from the Reformation to Jonathan Edwards. So the Christian Library was in no way a perfect or complete thing. Wesley, however, still found it effective, eminently so, personally so. Now, much conversation swirls around Wesley's conversion story or his childhood trope about surviving a house fire like a brand plucked from the fire. I think not enough, though, has been stated about the intermediate period between the time that he left home and went to college and the time that he had his conversion. The 12 years leading up to the Aldersgate Street experience might be the most fascinating. Wesley's personal journey began late in his college years at Oxford. Though he had an amazing Christian upbringing under an amazing woman by the name of Susanna Wesley, John enjoyed a fancy-free life for much of his college years. However, at the close of his time at Oxford, he became earnest, even obsessive about pursuing holiness. No one knows why for sure. Maybe the cavalier life that he lived in college revealed that he was not as godly as he thought he was. And we don't know what caused this turnaround, but we do know Wesley had no confidence that he was truly a Christian. So for 12 long years, Wesley struggled to find security in his faith. Listen to what he did. He plunged into the writings and history of the church divines. He pored over the history of primitive church and he surveyed medieval mystics, and he studied reformers and was considerably impacted by modern pietists. In his sacred roots study, he saw in these lives what he himself was looking for, what eluded him, but what he longed for, and what the experiences that these persons had inspired him to hunger more. The experience with God that brought the assurance of faith is what John Wesley wanted. And he did everything he could to find it. He looked for it in the church liturgy. He looked for it in spiritual disciplines. He fasted so much that he was called a fanatic. They called him a Methodist. And they called him a Methodist after a group of religious dissenters in the late 1600s who had revolutionary ideas. He found mysticism too unreasonable, but he loved their testimonies of a real experience with God. As a last-ditch effort, he became a missionary to the colonies in America. Maybe if he gave his whole life, his whole heart would follow. Wesley's Georgia mission was an utter failure, however. And after 9 months, he abandoned the missionary post in shame. He returned to London to escape his failure in ministry and his failure in faith. Wesley sought for 12 years to find faith security, and he finally found it in 1738 at the Aldersgate experience. But those 12 years that he was searching, he was motivated and inspired by his foray into his sacred roots. On May 24th, 1738, at a Moravian Band Society meeting on Aldersgate Street in London, Wesley found his experience with God, that security of faith. Wesley found this experience in a session, listening to a reading of Martin Luther's preface to Paul's epistle to the Romans. So check this out. As we think about the importance of sacred roots, God met Wesley time and time again to inspire, convict, and convince through sacred readings, sacred roots. Wesley leaned on the library to train disciples and leaders, but he also used it to establish a culture. He believed he could culture his people through what they read. He admonished his preachers to read 4 and 5 hours a day as a base, and then more if they could fit it in. Half this time was for the Bible, and half was for the library. The library content showed people how to deal with personal challenges, and it also clarified a reasonable view of revival. It challenged people to embrace holiness, and it taught basic doctrine. The library content also sourced sermons and spurred conversations amongst the community. It got people talking about what Wesley thought they should be talking about. For the Christian library to work, however, it had to be read. It had to be read properly. Wesley had to set up the proper accountability, select the proper readings, and instill the proper discipline. For the library to work, everyone had to hear about it, know about it, and be talking about it. Wesley accomplished this with a top-down approach. Itinerant ministers were encouraged, you can read ordered, to carry a new book with them wherever they went in the traveling circuit. They obviously could not carry the entire library on horseback, but Wesley published excerpts for them to take. Books were to be passed around in the communities and discussed at length. Wesley paid and published 100 copies of the entire 50-volume collection and set them in as many preach houses as possible. They were meant for local lay preachers to check out and to read. At annual meetings, preachers were instructed about their daily reading, and then they were examined as to whether or not these readings were actually done. Wesley used his structure to hold everybody accountable. I've meant to show you in this talk that the Christian library was an essential component in John Wesley's resilient, generation impacting work. It offered depth to Wesley's leadership while expanding the number of people that he could reach. It saved him from the bottleneck that existed because he only had a number of trained leaders. Now, it not only helped in training lay leaders, but it was also used to develop a culture among all Methodists. Not only did it have impact in Wesley's time, but it was used well after Wesley died. Even was updated in 1817. I've taken this time to tell the story of John Wesley and his movement to show how the Christian library was essential to that movement. I hope, in seeing its importance in such an impactful movement, you might imagine how incorporating sacred roots can deepen, broaden, and enrich your movement today. Thank you.
All right. So you can only imagine how much stuff I actually left out. There's just so much richness uh, in the story and example of John Wesley, in particular to what we are after today. Um, so if you have any comments that you would like to make, we got about 4 minutes, but I'd love for you to throw those comments into the chat, and that way we can capture them and benefit from it. As already we've seen a lot, some of you grew up Methodist in one way or another, and were benefited from that experience. Um, and so I have Ted, for instance, saying, I am interested in the statement related to Wesley's reputation of spending less time writing about doctrine and more time developing a sacred roots like library for discipleship. The implications for our love of doctrine more than the great tradition seems formidable. This is not to suggest that there is no solid doctrine in practicing sacred roots within bands, but to suggest it might be possible to conclude that for Wesley, there was less doctrinal work to be done beyond the tradition and more to be done in living it out. Great comment. Thank you. Thank you. I see. I'm committed to developing tools and library consistent with the great tradition. Thanks to Sacred Roots for help in this. All right. Randy says, it's ironic that reformers like Calvin quoted early church extensively. I first learned about Augustine from Calvin. All right. Carl says, I think Wesley's time in Georgia changed his life. Carl, you are correct, I think, as a part of what happened developmentally over the 12 years in that intermediate period. I am convicted by Wesley's flexibility in a time of God's moving. So yes, please put your comments in the chat box. Put your comments in the chat box if you would, please. And you know, just so that we have about 2 minutes left, I'm gonna ask Don, man. Let's talk a second.
Excellent. Yes.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, what grabbed you, brother?
To me, it thank you, Pastor, really, for what you shared. It was so rich and so thought-provoking. What really grabbed me is the population that we serve.
Mm.
Essentially, Wesley designed a library, a collection of tools based on how he could, if I understand you right, that he could ensure both depth and breadth in
Yes.
ministry. Depth
Absolutely.
in the sense of that everyone needs to be trained, and breadth in the sense that we need to reach thousands and thousands of folk, and quite honestly, we don't have time. And I
Right.
wonder if you drape the same issues that Wesley focused on, how will we solve these things now? How do we actually distribute the core of the great tradition for learners, many of whom have no academic background, can't read? We're going to have to think of new ways to distribute the truths of the great tradition in a way that's true to the tradition, but also true to the people who receive it.
Right. Right.
He did it through books. Maybe we could do it through media or theater or musics or
Right.
something. That was one of the first things
I thought about that. That was a major issue for me, thinking through both this lecture and also participating in the Sacred Roots. And I think it's really all of our responsibility now. You know, now that Evangel is putting this on the table with these resources. I think now we have to all use our own resources to creatively and critically put this out.
Yeah.
And so, and I love theater. I love music. I love podcasts. I love, audiobook readings and all of that kind of stuff. And I think it's something that we all have to do together. The lesson I learned from Wesley is he tried to do it by himself.
Yeah.
And the product was limited by that. So if we come together to do it, it can really make a bigger difference.
Oh, to me, I can't thank you. I thank you on behalf of all of us for the insights that you provided. This is right in the center of what we were looking for. Hank, asking Pastor to do this is probably the best thing that you've done so far in everything. Just really well done. Outstanding, really.
Well, thank you. My time is up and I want to be faithful to that. So thank you all for the time and thank you all for your messages of encouragement. We're looking forward to continuing to work together.